Topic Chapter 1. I walked into the Chatham County Courthouse expecting to lose my husband. I didn't know I was about to lose my mind. The air conditioning in courtroom 4B was broken. It was a suffocating Savannah afternoon. The room smelled like old pine polish and cheap desperation. I sat perfectly still at the petitioner's table. Mercer sat exactly 10 feet away from me. He was wearing his good Navy seersucker suit. The devil doesn't wear horns, honey. He wears seersucker. He wants my mother's coastal land. 300 acres of ancestral Jamaican-American property. My family bled for that soil. He wants to tear down the old weeping oaks. He wants to pave it all over for luxury condos. I told him I would rather die, so he filed for divorce. He claimed I was mentally unfit to manage the estate. Just 10 minutes earlier, I was in the women's restroom. The fluorescent lights were buzzing above the sinks. Blythe was standing right behind me, my best friend of 28 long years. She was fixing the collar of my emerald linen blazer. I remember looking at her hands in the mirror. Her pale hands were trembling just a little bit. She gave me a tight, nervous smile. I thought she was just anxious for me. Bless her rotten heart. I actually reached up and squeezed her cold fingers. I told her everything was going to be fine. Now, we were back in the sweltering courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open at the back. The bailiff cleared his throat loudly. He called the next witness for the defense. Blythe the Covington. I turned around in my uncomfortable wooden chair. I smiled. I was ready to watch my oldest friend defend my character. Blythe walked down the center aisle. Her expensive heels clicked on the marble floor. Click, click, click. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes completely locked on the judge's bench. She walked right past my table. The air completely left my lungs. She sat down on Mercer's side of the room, right next to Langston. Langston is Mercer's cutthroat snake oil attorney, the man orchestrating the theft of my family's legacy. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. A wave of physical nausea hit me. It hit me so hard I tasted bile. I gripped the table edge to keep from falling out of my chair. The sharp wood dug deep into my sweating palms. My brain simply couldn't process the image in front of me. Blythe, sitting with the enemy. Langston stood up and smoothed his expensive silk tie. He walked slowly up to the judge's elevated bench. He was holding a thick manila folder in his hands. It looked incredibly heavy. He placed it dramatically on the polished mahogany wood. I leaned forward. I was squinting through the dim courthouse lighting. The folder had a stark white label on the front. It read, Exhibit J, Communications 2012 to 2023. 11 years. 11 years of my private life inside that folder. But that wasn't the part that stopped my beating heart. I saw the index tab sticking out the right side. It was written in bright blue ink. It was Blythe's distinct, looping, cursive handwriting. The exact same handwriting from every birthday card she ever gave me. You know that feeling when your gut is screaming at you? When your body knows you're in danger before your brain catches up? I was drowning in it right then. The heavy scent of gardenias drifted over from Blythe's perfume. It suddenly smelled exactly like a funeral parlor. Langston leaned down and whispered something into Mercer's ear. Mercer actually had the audacity to smirk at me. A cold, prickly sweat broke out on the back of my neck. What did she give them? What has she been collecting for over a decade? My hands were shaking so hard I had to hide them in my lap. I stared at the back of Blythe's perfectly styled blonde head. 28 years of secrets suddenly weaponized. The judge picked up the heavy manila folder. He broke the red legal seal with his thumb. He opened it incredibly slowly. The courtroom was dead, suffocatingly silent. I could hear my own rapid heartbeat thudding in my ears. The judge opened the thick folder. He looked over his reading glasses directly at me. He asked a question that froze the blood in my veins. Mrs. Katora, did you actually write these words about your husband? He paused and looked down at Blythe. Or is your mental state as fragile as this witness claims? Topic Chapter 2. The judge's voice echoed off the heavy mahogany paneling in courtroom 4B. Mrs. Covington, did you write these words? I stared at the paper in front of me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry hornets. My own handwriting stared back from the page. A journal entry from November 4th, 2018. It said, Mercer is suffocating me. I think I am losing my grip on reality. I flipped to the next page. A printed screenshot of a text message. Sometimes I want to drive my car straight into the Savannah River. I couldn't breathe. My throat felt like it was packed with dry cotton. The courtroom smelled intensely of cheap floor wax and old sweat. I looked up at the judge. I forced the words out. "Yes, Your Honor." I wrote them. Langston smiled, a cold, reptilian stretch of his thin lips. Mercer didn't even look at me. He just casually adjusted the cuffs of his navy seersucker suit. I dropped my gaze to my lap. My hands were trembling so violently I had to grip my phone. I swiped the screen awake under the heavy oak defense table. My lock screen is a scanned photo. A faded Polaroid from July 1998. It shows me and Blythe laughing on the wraparound porch of my townhouse. We were so incredibly young. Blythe is wearing a delicate gold gardenia necklace. I bought it for her 25th birthday at a little shop on Broughton Street. We met in 1995 at a junior league charity auction. She accidentally bid $500 on a hideous ceramic rooster. I bought it off her for $600 just to stop her crying. We had been inseparable ever since. 28 years. Gone. A sharp pain shot through my chest. The kind of sudden, physical ache that makes you want to fold in half. I closed my eyes and remembered the scent of lilies and damp earth. My mother's funeral, 6 years ago. Blythe stood right beside me at the cemetery in the pouring rain. She held my hand so tight, my knuckles turned white. She was my anchor. When Mercer was out of town on mysterious business trips, Blythe was there. When my mother passed, Blythe was there. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek right there in the courtroom. I wasn't crying over the Jamaican-American coastal land. I was mourning a sister. My mind drifted away from the judge's droning voice. I thought about my 1800 Savannah townhouse, the wide heart pine floors, the smell of lemon oil and old paper. Blythe basically lived there with me. We spent hundreds of sticky summer afternoons in the parlor, drinking ice-sweet tea out of heavy crystal highballs, gossiping about Mercer's ridiculous real estate developments. But things shifted about 10 months ago. We were sitting at the kitchen island. The afternoon sun was pouring through the white plantation shutters. The smell of blooming gardenias drifted through the open window. Blythe leaned across the cool marble counter. She touched my arm. She used the soft, deeply concerned voice. "Keturah, honey, you've been forgetting things lately." She told me about a Dr. Fenwick. She called him a discreet psychiatrist. She said he could help with my sudden memory lapses. She even slid his cream-colored business card across the marble. I thought she was just being a good friend. Bless her rotten heart. I should have seen the hunger in her eyes. It wasn't just about my failing marriage. It was the house, my family's estate. I pictured her standing in my grand foyer 10 months ago. She was running her hands over the original mahogany banister. She stroked the dark wood like it was a living thing. Her eyes were wide, covetous, wistful. She looked at the intricate molding like a starving woman looking at a feast. Why was she so obsessed with my house? I always thought she just appreciated historic preservation. I was a blind, trusting fool. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker. And sometimes he uses your best friend to do his dirty work. The gavel slammed down. The sharp crack pulled me violently back to courtroom 4B. The judge ordered a 15-minute recess. I stood up on shaking legs. I smoothed down the lapels of my emerald linen blazer. I looked across the center aisle at the plaintiff's table. Blythe wasn't looking at me. She was leaning over and whispering into Mercer's ear. He nodded and gently patted her hand. A 28-year friendship, reduced to a weaponized manila folder labeled Exhibit J. I trusted her with the darkest corners of my marriage. I didn't know she was taking notes. Top of Chapter 3. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. 15-minute recess, the judge announced. I stood up on legs that felt like wet sand. My hands gripped the heavy oak defense table. Across the aisle, Blythe leaned in. She whispered right into Mercer's ear. He smirked. That little half smile made my blood run cold. The bailiff opened the gate for me. I could hear Mercer laughing behind me. I turned and walked out the heavy double doors. The hallway smelled like floor wax and stale desperation. I leaned against the cool plaster wall. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing. I knew exactly what was in that manila folder now. Exhibit J wasn't just my old text messages. It was the blueprint of my destruction. It was every secret I had ever shared. You see, I never wanted this divorce. I filed 6 months ago out of pure survival. Do you know that feeling when the floor drops out from under your life? It started on a Tuesday in October. The house was dead quiet. I was in the mudroom looking for Mercer's spare truck keys. I unzipped the side pocket of his leather golf bag. My hand brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. I pulled it out and smoothed it flat against the washing machine. It was a Truist bank statement. The account number wasn't ours. The balance made my breath catch in my throat. $150,000 gone. Just like that, the transaction line read, Wire Transfer, Palmetto Holdings, LLC. I stared at the date printed in black ink, November 12th. Exactly 1 week after my mother died. 1 week after I inherited the historic Savannah townhouse. My hand started shaking so hard the paper rattled. I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my throat. I walked straight into the kitchen. The afternoon sun was pouring through the plantation shutters. Mercer was sitting at the island. He was calmly peeling an orange. I slammed the crumpled bank statement onto the marble counter. I asked him what Palmetto Holdings LLC was. I asked him where my mother's money went. I expected him to yell. I expected him to deny it. He didn't do either. He slowly finished peeling his orange. Then he looked up at me. His eyes were completely dead. There was no anger, no panic, just a cold, flat stare. You need to stop digging, Katora, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. He didn't even blink. A cold terror washed over my entire body. The man sitting in my kitchen was a stranger. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker. I grabbed my purse and ran out the back door. I drove straight to Blythe's house in Ardsley Park. My tires squealed, pulling into her driveway. I didn't even knock. I just walked right through her front door. I collapsed onto her green velvet sofa. The smell of her lavender candle made me sick to my stomach. I was a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. I ruined my mascara, crying into her decorative pillows. I told her everything. I told her about the hidden money. I told her about Mercer's dead eyes. I told her I thought I was losing my mind. Blythe sat next to me and rubbed my back. She handed me a tissue. Her phone was sitting face up on the glass coffee table. The screen was dark. I should have known then. I should have remembered the way she looked at my home. Just 2 weeks prior, she had stood in my foyer. She ran her hands over my antique mahogany banister. She looked up at the crystal chandelier. Her eyes were wide and hungry. I would do absolutely anything to live in a house like this, she had whispered. I thought she was just being complimentary. Bless her rotten heart. I was so incredibly blind. I sat there on her sofa, completely broken. I trusted her with my life. Blythe poured me a glass of wine and told me I was doing the right thing. What she didn't tell me was that her phone was actively recording our entire conversation. Chapter 4. I stood in that courthouse hallway staring at the scuffed marble floor. The recess clock was ticking down, 12 minutes left. My blood felt like ice water. 6 months ago, I sat on Blythe's green velvet sofa. I poured my broken heart out. Her phone was sitting right there on the glass coffee table. The screen was dark, but it was actively recording every single sob. Bless her rotten heart. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. And sometimes he wears Chanel No. 5. I touched the cold brass handle of the courtroom door. 10 minutes left. I didn't have a master plan. I just had a sickening knot in my stomach. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. Courtroom 4B smelled like lemon floor polish and stale sweat. I walked down the center aisle. My heels clicked loudly against the hardwood. I sat down at the heavy defense table. My attorney, Mr. Hayes, was frantically scribbling on a yellow legal pad. He looked completely blindsided. The bailiff cleared his throat. The judge struck his wooden gavel. The 15-minute recess was officially over. Langston stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his immaculate navy suit. He called Blythe to the witness stand. Blythe walked up there like she was attending a Savannah garden party. She placed her hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the whole truth. Her hand didn't even tremble. Langston walked over to a metal projector cart. He flipped a switch. The cooling fan hummed to life. A harsh, bright square of light hit the 10-foot screen behind the judge's bench. I looked up at the screen. My stomach dropped straight to my shoes. It was a printed WhatsApp chat. My name was right there at the top in bold letters. The timestamp said 11:42 p.m. The date was October 14th, 2018. Langston handed Blythe a crisp piece of paper. Mrs. Covington, could you read the highlighted text for the court? He asked. His voice dripped with fake sympathy. Blythe adjusted her reading glasses. She cleared her throat into the microphone. It says, "I swear to God, I wish Mercer would just drive his car straight into the Savannah River." Her voice echoed off the high plaster ceilings. The silence that followed was suffocating. Out of context, it sounded like a calculated murder plot. It sounded like the violent ravings of an unstable, dangerous woman, but I remembered that exact night. It was a Tuesday in late 2018. It was pouring rain. Mercer had locked me out of our historic townhouse after a screaming match. I was sitting in my car in the cobblestone driveway. The engine was running just to keep the heater on. My clothes were completely soaked through. I was shivering, exhausted, and ugly crying. I typed that angry message to my best friend. I was desperately looking for a lifeline in the dark. The Savannah River is deep and fast. Mercer always joked about the dangerous currents. I used his own joke against him in a moment of pure frustration. Blythe knew that. She knew my heart. I stared up at that giant projector screen. My eyes scanned the edges of the image. Something was missing. The gray text bubbles were gone. Blythe's replies were entirely cropped out of the frame. She had texted back that night. She had written, "He's a monster, honey. He deserves it." She had actively fueled my fire. But the judge couldn't see that. The court only saw my isolated green bubbles of rage. My hands started shaking again. I grabbed the sharp edge of the defense table. The polished wood dug deep into my palms. I forced myself to take a breath. How much more does she have? I looked over at Langston's desk. That thick manila folder was sitting right there. Exhibit J. 11 years of my private pain. 11 years of vulnerable late-night text to my sister in Christ. All of it carefully collected. All of it surgically cropped and weaponized. They were building a paper trail to prove I was losing my mind. If I was crazy, Mercer got control of my ancestral coastal land. He got to pave over my history. You know that feeling when the floor completely drops out from under you? When you realize the monster isn't hiding under your bed. The monster is sitting right there on the witness stand, and she's wearing your favorite shade of lipstick. Langston paced slowly in front of the jury box. He stopped and looked directly at Blythe. "Mrs. Covington, when you received that text, did you fear for Mercer's physical safety?" Langston asked. Blythe looked down at her manicured hands. She blinked twice. She squeezed out a single perfect tear. "Yes," she whispered into the microphone. "I was absolutely terrified for him." The panic rose in my chest like dark floodwater. I couldn't catch my breath. The walls of courtroom 4B felt like they were closing in. I looked across the aisle at Mercer. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at me, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I stared across the courtroom aisle. Mercer was still smiling at me. It was a cold, empty look. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. My lungs felt completely empty. The 15-minute recess was officially over. I was drowning in suffocating panic. Mr. Hayes leaned in close to my ear. He smelled like stale peppermint and pure panic. He whispered, "We need the original messages, Katora." He tapped his silver pen on his yellow legal pad. He meant the WhatsApp chat from Exhibit J, the one Blythe had surgically cropped to frame me. I nodded slowly. My hands were clammy against the polished wood. I needed to get my phone. I needed to prove she deleted her own replies, but my phone was sitting in the mudroom at my townhouse. The judge struck his wooden gavel. The sharp crack echoed off the heavy oak doors. Langston called Blythe back to the microphone. She smoothed the lapels of her emerald linen blazer. Bless her rotten heart. She looked straight at the judge with wide, innocent eyes. She adjusted the microphone with a trembling hand. She said, "Your Honor, Katura has been mentally unraveling for a year." Langston paced in front of the witness stand. He asked her to elaborate for the court. Blythe pulled a white tissue from her pocket. She dabbed at a completely dry eye. Then she started listing my supposed failures. She mentioned the time I lost Mercer's spare truck keys. She brought up my 3 missed estate appraisals in October. Then she mentioned the stove. My blood ran cold. I gripped the edge of the defense table. My fingernails dug into the heavy wood. It was exactly 8 months ago. A muggy Tuesday afternoon. We were at my historic townhouse in Savannah. I'd gone upstairs to grab my reading glasses. I left Blythe sitting on my green velvet sofa. Suddenly, the smoke alarm started screaming. The sound was absolutely piercing. I ran down the antique mahogany banister. The kitchen was thick with acrid gray smoke. It smelled like burning metal and ruined enamel. Blythe was standing by the marble island. She was holding a floral kitchen towel over her mouth. A heavy copper pot was scorching on the front gas burner. The orange flames were licking the sides. I hadn't even turned the stove on that day. Blythe looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She coughed dramatically into the towel. She said, "Keturah, you left the burner on high." She said, "You could have burned the house down." I stood there in the smoke and cried. I truly thought I was losing my mind. Sitting in courtroom 4B, the truth finally hit me. It hit me like a runaway freight train. I looked at Blythe sitting on the witness stand. I thought about the lost truck keys. I thought about the missed appraisal appointments. Blythe was at my house for every single one of those events. She was the one who poured the iced sweet tea. She was the one who moved my desk calendar. She was the one who turned on the stove. Langston walked over to the metal projector cart. He placed a new piece of evidence under the camera. It flashed onto the 10-foot screen. It was a handwritten journal entry. The date at the top said March 14th. It was written in Blythe's looping blue cursive. The note read, "I am so worried about Keturah's memory." It continued, "She is becoming a danger to herself." I squinted at the massive screen. Something was wrong with the image. You know that feeling when your gut is screaming at you? I looked closer at the projected handwriting. The ink was bleeding slightly at the edges. It looked thick and glossy under the harsh light. I leaned closer to Mr. Hayes. I pointed a shaking finger at the screen. I whispered, "Look at the pressure marks." The paper wasn't indented or aged. The ink was completely fresh. She hadn't written that a year ago. She wrote it last week. Mercer wanted my ancestral coastal land in Jamaica. He wanted to pave it over for a luxury resort. He needed me declared mentally unfit to steal it, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed a witness I trusted implicitly. He bought my best friend of 28 years. He put her on his payroll to sabotage my sanity. The suffocating panic vanished. A hot, blinding fury took its place. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my throat. I looked from Mercer's smug face to Blythe's fake tears. I hadn't been losing my mind. My best friend had been systematically breaking into my reality. Top at Chapter 6, the wooden gavel hit the sounding block like a gunshot. 15-minute recess, the judge announced. His voice echoed off the high-paneled walls of courtroom 4B. I didn't sit back down. I leaned over the heavy oak defense table. I grabbed Mr. Hayes by his seersucker sleeve. My fingers dug into the crinkled fabric. "I need to hold that original March 14th journal page," I whispered. My voice was shaking, but not from fear. "The ink is fresh. There are no pressure marks on the paper." Mr. Hayes blinked. His eyes went wide behind his tortoiseshell reading glasses. He looked down at his yellow legal pad. He nodded once, a sharp, tight movement. "Let me handle the clerk," he muttered. I turned away from him. I watched Blythe slip out the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. She was moving fast. I followed her. The courthouse hallway was freezing. It smelled strongly of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. My emerald linen blazer felt like a suit of armor. I heard the click of Blythe's heels rounding the corner. I pushed through the heavy wooden door of the women's restroom on the second floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. It was a harsh, unforgiving glare. Blythe was standing at the second sink. She was gripping the white porcelain edges so hard her knuckles were white. Her shoulders were heaving up and down. I stepped inside. I locked the bathroom door behind me. The deadbolt slid into place with a loud metallic crack. Blythe spun around. She gasped. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks. Fake tears. "Bless her rotten heart. Keturah, please," she sobbed. She held up both hands. "You have to understand." I just stood there on the hexagonal floor tiles. My chest was tight. My hands were balled into fists at my sides. The silence between us felt heavy and suffocating. "Understand what, Blythe?" I asked. My voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't even sound like me. "Understand that you sold me out for a Savannah townhouse?" She reached out toward me. I took a sharp step back. My heel scraped against the tile. "Mercer subpoenaed me," she cried. Her voice cracked perfectly. "He threatened to ruin me, Keturah." She grabbed a rough brown paper towel from the dispenser. She dabbed frantically at her eyes. She was putting on a masterclass in victimhood. "He said he would take my house in Ardsley Park." She whimpered. He said his lawyers would destroy my interior design business. I had no choice. For 3 full seconds, the room went completely silent. Only the sound of the dripping silver faucet filled the space. I looked at her face, the face of my best friend of 28 years. God help me, I almost believed her. My brain did that thing where it tries to protect you from the unthinkable. I actually felt a brief, pathetic flicker of pity. I thought about all those years at my historic townhouse, all those Sunday dinners sitting around my kitchen island, the smell of roasted chicken and gardenias in the air. Blythe would sit there drinking iced sweet tea from my crystal highballs. Mercer would walk in and make some tedious, condescending joke. Blythe would catch my eye. She would roll her eyes behind his back. She always pretended she could barely tolerate him. She acted like he was just an annoying obstacle in our friendship. It was a performance, a 28-year award-winning performance. You know that feeling when your gut is screaming at you, but your heart begs you to stay blind? I was standing right on that terrible edge. I wanted to hug her. I wanted to tell her we would fix this. Then she made a mistake, a careless, arrogant mistake. Blythe set her phone face up on the wet porcelain sink. She turned the silver handle to wash the mascara off her hands. The water rushed out. Her phone screen lit up. A text notification banner popped down from the top. I looked down at the glowing glass. The background was a picture of her golden retriever. Ice water flooded my veins. My heartbeat pounded violently in my ears. The text was from a contact saved simply as M. The message didn't say anything about subpoenas. It didn't mention threats or lawyers or Ardsley Park real estate. It said, "You're doing great. Stick to the script." I froze. I stared at the black text in that little white bubble. Stick to the script. It was time-stamped exactly 1 minute ago. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. And apparently, he texts his accomplices from the plaintiff's table during a recess. I slowly raised my eyes from the glowing phone. I looked at Blythe's reflection in the smudged bathroom mirror. She hadn't noticed the notification. The screen went dark again. She was still softly crying, splashing cold water on her face, playing the terrified victim. The pity vanished instantly. The hot, blinding fury returned. It settled deep in my bones, cold and sharp. I wondered right then exactly how long they had been working together. Was it just these last 10 months of gaslighting, or had she been reporting back to him for years? I didn't say another word to her. I didn't scream. I didn't slap her, though my right palm was itching to do it. I just turned around. I unlocked the heavy bathroom door. I walked back out into the sterile, wax-smelling hallway. She wasn't a hostage to his legal team. She was his star employee. I walked back into courtroom 4B. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. The air conditioning was freezing. Mr. Hayes was waiting at the defense table. He held up a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was the original March 14th journal page. The judge had granted our emergency motion. Court was officially adjourned for the day. An independent expert was going to test that bleeding ink. Mercer glared at me from across the aisle. His seersucker suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. I didn't look away. I just smiled. By 7 o'clock that evening, the Savannah heat was suffocating. I was sitting at the mahogany desk in my home office. The room smelled like lemon oil and old paper. I wasn't alone. Mr. Hayes had brought in a specialist. Her name was Miss Vance. She was a bulldog of a financial attorney. She wore a sharp black blazer and zero makeup. She had my crumpled Truist Bank statement spread out on the desk. We needed to prove Blythe wasn't just a concerned friend. We needed to prove she was actively on Mercer's payroll. Ms. Vance tapped her silver pen against the glass coffee table. She told me we needed to subpoena Blythe's personal bank records, but judges don't just hand over financial subpoenas on a hunch. We needed a concrete thread to pull, a legal reason to look. I stared out the dark window. The reflection of my crystal chandelier glowed in the glass. I thought about Blythe. I thought about her sloppy habits. She was always terrible with technology. I pulled my MacBook across the desk. The aluminum felt cold under my wrists. I opened up our shared iCloud photo album. Blythe and I had used it for nearly a decade. It was meant for our annual girls' trips to Charleston. I started scrolling through the grid of thumbnails. Hundreds of smiling photos flashed across the screen. Vacations, birthdays, Tuesday afternoon cocktails on my veranda. It made my stomach physically turn. I was hunting for a ghost in a graveyard of fake memories. I scrolled back exactly 5 months. A specific picture caught my eye. It was Blythe standing in an Ardsley Park driveway. She was leaning against a brand new silver BMW. I remembered the exact day she bought it. She had driven it straight over to my historic townhouse. She strutted into my kitchen smelling like new car leather and Chanel No. 5. I had asked her how she afforded it. She looked me dead in the eye and lied. She said a distant aunt in Atlanta had passed away. She called it a modest inheritance. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker. And apparently he buys his accomplices luxury sedans. I kept scrolling past the photos of the car. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I stopped. There was a random image tucked between two pictures of a steering wheel. It wasn't a photograph. It was a digital screenshot. Blythe must have selected it by accident when uploading her car pictures. I clicked on it to make it full screen. My breath hitched in my throat. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor. It was a snapshot of her mobile banking app. The screen showed a completed transaction receipt. The date was October 12th. The exact amount was $4,000. But it was the sender's name that made my blood freeze. It was typed in crisp black digital letters. Palmetto Holdings, LLC. I stared at those 3 words. The glowing screen illuminated the dark office. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My mind raced back to Mercer's crumpled Truist bank statement, the one I had found stuffed in his leather golf bag. That statement showed a massive wire transfer, $150,000 of my inheritance, sent directly to Palmetto Holdings, LLC on November 12th. I'd spent weeks assuming it was a shell company. I thought Mercer was just hiding assets for the impending divorce. I was wrong. I turned the laptop around to face Ms. Vance. I pointed at the screen. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. Palmetto Holdings wasn't an offshore account. It was the payroll for my destruction. Ms. Vance stared at the Palmetto Holdings screenshot on my MacBook. Her sharp black blazer seemed to stiffen. Mr. Hayes exhaled a long, ragged breath. He dropped his silver pen onto my glass coffee table. The silence in my home office was absolutely deafening. They needed physical proof. Digital screenshots can be easily contested in a courtroom. Mercer's high-priced lawyers would just claim I photoshopped the image. I needed to hold the actual paper bank records in my hands. The paper trail was my only way out. I reached into the pocket of my emerald linen blazer. My fingers brushed against cold, heavy brass. It was an antique skeleton key. I had kept it on my keyring for exactly 19 years. I stared at the tarnished metal. Blythe gave it to me back in the spring of 2005. We were standing in her cobblestone driveway in Ardsley Park. She pressed the cold metal right into my palm. "My house is your house, always," she had said. Bless her rotten heart. Mr. Hayes was piecing my mahogany floorboards. He was muttering about getting a judge to force Blythe's testimony. I stopped him right there. I told him Blythe was never subpoenaed. She wasn't forced to hand over Exhibit J to avoid perjury. She volunteered it. She had curated those text messages over 11 long years. She handed Mercer the knife. Then she showed him exactly where to plunge it into my back. Mr. Hayes stopped pacing. He looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. I knew exactly where Blythe kept her financial documents. She had a heavy oak filing cabinet in her home office. I also knew her Thursday routine. Every Thursday morning, she had a standing appointment at the Sea Island Spa. Mercer paid for it, naturally. The next morning, the Savannah air was thick and humid. I parked my car 2 blocks away from her house. It was exactly 11:14 a.m. I know because I checked the dashboard clock 3 times. My palms were sweating against the leather steering wheel. I walked up the brick pathway to Blythe's porch. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the brass key. I slipped it into the heavy oak door. It turned with a soft, metallic click. The brass knob was warm from the morning sun. I stepped into her foyer. The air smelled of lavender candles and Chanel No. 5. That familiar scent made my stomach physically turn. I closed the door quietly behind me. The silence of the empty house pressed against my ears. I was committing a felony. Breaking and entering. If I was caught, Mercer would have the final nail for my coffin, but I was far past the point of caring. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. And I was going to prove it. I took 2 steps toward the hallway. Then I froze. A tiny green light was blinking on the living room bookshelf. It was a small black dome, a security indoor camera. Mercer must have installed it recently to monitor his investment. My blood ran completely cold. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor. The dust coated the fabric of my navy trousers. I had to crawl. I dragged myself across her expensive Persian rug. My joints ached with every movement. The coarse wool burned through my pants. I kept my head down. I stood entirely below the camera's line of sight. I crawled past the green velvet sofa. I crawled past the glass coffee table where we used to drink sweet tea. I finally made it to the home office. The door was cracked open just a few inches. I pushed it gently and crawled inside. I stayed low until I was safely behind her massive mahogany desk. The room smelled like stale coffee and printer ink. My heart was pounding in my throat. I could feel my pulse vibrating in my teeth. I reached up and grabbed the brass handle of the bottom drawer. I pulled, it didn't budge. It was locked tight. Of course it was locked. I sat back on my heels. I forced myself to breathe. Blythe was meticulous, but she was also incredibly predictable. She always kept a spare for everything. She hated being locked out of her own life. I reached under the center lip of the desk. I ran my fingers along the rough wood. My fingernail caught on a piece of clear tape. Taped right underneath was a tiny silver key. I pulled it free. The tape left a sticky residue on my thumb. My breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I slid the silver key into the bottom drawer lock. It turned with a sharp snap. I pulled the heavy drawer open. It screeched loudly on its metal tracks. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet house. I squeezed my eyes shut. I waited for an alarm to go off. I waited for police sirens. Nothing happened. The house remained dead silent. I opened my eyes and looked inside the drawer. It was packed tight with thick manila folders. I started digging frantically. I bypassed the 2019 tax returns. I ignored the homeowner's insurance policies. I pushed aside a stack of medical receipts. I was looking for Palmetto Holdings. My fingernails scraped against the very back of the wooden drawer. My hand hit something hard and smooth. It wasn't a manila folder. It was tucked all the way in the back, hidden completely from view. I pulled it out into the light. Underneath a stack of glossy Vogue magazines, I found a black leather binder, and the first page had Mercer's signature on it. Top it Chapter 9. I stared at the black leather binder in the dim light of Blythe's office. Mercer's signature was right there on the first page, bold, arrogant. Written in his favorite blue ink, the leather smelled like expensive polish and secrets. My hands felt like ice. I flipped the heavy parchment page. It was a formal legal document. The header read, Independent Consulting Agreement. Party A was Palmetto Holdings, LLC. Party B was Blythe Covington. Bless her rotten heart. I ran my finger down the crisp white paper. Section 3 outlined the exact scope of work. I read the words 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It said, monitoring and reporting on the domestic habits of KM. Ketua Mercer. Me. My best friend of 28 years was officially on payroll as my warden. I pulled out my phone. My thumb was shaking so badly I dropped it on the Persian rug. It landed with a soft thud. I snatched it up and opened the camera app. I double-checked that my phone was on silent. I made sure the flash was off. Click. Page 1. Click. Page 2. I flipped to the compensation clause. There it was in stark black and white. Retainer fee, $4,000 per calendar month. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. And apparently he pays his spies on the first of the month. I turned to the final page to photograph the signatures. That was when I saw the execution date at the bottom. November 14th, 11 months ago. The air completely left my lungs. I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk to stay standing. November 14th of last year. That was the exact day after my mother's funeral. My mind snapped back to that rainy afternoon. The whole house smelled like dying gardenias and damp wool. I was sitting on my kitchen floor, completely numb with grief. Blythe had walked through the back door holding a warm chicken casserole. She had knelt down beside me. She had kissed my forehead. She told me she would take care of everything. She held me while I cried until my ribs physically ached. And the entire time the ink on this contract was practically still wet. I stared down at her loopy blue signature on the page. She had just signed her soul over to Mercer. Then she drove straight to my historic townhouse to play the grieving sister. Would you have ever suspected a betrayal that deep? I felt bile rise in the back of my throat. It tasted like copper and old coffee. I swallowed it down hard. There was no time to fall apart on this rug. It was 11:22 a.m. I carefully closed the black leather binder. I slid it exactly where I found it, right behind the 2019 tax returns. I pushed the heavy oak drawer shut. It locked with a soft metallic click. I took the tiny silver key and pressed it back into the clear tape. I stuck it blindly underneath the mahogany desk. I smoothed the edges flat with my thumb. I stood up and brushed off my emerald linen blazer. Now came the hard part. I had to get out of this house undetected. I stepped out of the home office and into the hallway. I pressed my back against the floral wallpaper. I edged toward the living room archway. The air in here smelled thickly of lavender candles. The black dome security camera was still perched on the bookshelf. Its little green light was steady and unblinking. I dropped my hands and knees on the hardwood floor. I crawled beneath the camera's line of sight. The wood was cold against my bare palms. My knees ached with every silent movement. I held my breath as I reached the heavy oak front door. I reached up and turned the brass knob as slowly as humanly possible. I slipped out onto the porch. I pulled the door shut behind me until the latch clicked. The humid Savannah air hit my face like a wet towel. I walked down the cobblestone driveway. I kept my head down. I didn't run. Running looks guilty. I made it back to my car parked 2 blocks away. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I gripped the leather steering wheel. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. I zoomed in on the date of that contract again. November 14th? The math was spinning violently in my head. I stared blankly at the dashboard clock. I filed for divorce 6 months ago. I thought I had blindsided Mercer. I thought I was the one finally escaping. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. But this contract started 11 months ago. Mercer wasn't reacting to my divorce. He had been planning it. Topic Chapter 10. I didn't even turn off the engine when I parked outside Ms. Vance's law office. I marched straight into her office, strapping my phone onto her legal pad. "Look at the photos," I told her. My voice sounded like crushed glass. Ms. Vance swiped through the pictures of the black leather binder, the independent consulting agreement between Mercer and Blythe Covington. The color drained from her face. "This contract is dated November 14th, she said. I felt a cold sweat. That was the day after my mother's funeral. Ms. Vance grabbed a silver pen, sketching a timeline on her pad. "Why did he put her on payroll in November?" she asked. I stared out the window at the cobblestone street. "Because of the land," I whispered. "My mother left me 40 acres of pristine coastal land in Jamaica. Mercer, a luxury real estate developer, had been salivating over it for a decade. My mother despised him, calling him the devil and seersucker. I remembered the funeral reception. He was there, holding bourbon, asking if the deed was finalized before she was even in the ground." Ms. Vance clicked on her MacBook, pulling up a satellite view of the coast. A red overlay appeared, a zoning inquiry for a 300-room luxury resort. The applicant was Palmetto Holdings, LLC. The filing date was October 28th, 2 weeks before my mother died. He knew her heart was failing. He knew the land would pass to me. I sank into the chair, the leather groaning. "I told him I would never sell it," I said. Ms. Vance looked at me, her expression grim. "Couture, if you wouldn't sell, he needed another way to control the asset." She pointed to the timeline. Mercer had hired my best friend to gaslight me, creating forged journal entries and texts. It was never just about the divorce. He needed to prove I was mentally incompetent so he could be granted conservatorship over my estate. Topic Chapter 11. We walked back into courtroom 4B exactly 14 minutes later. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us. The air conditioning was rattling loudly in the ceiling vents. It smelled like industrial floor wax and stale coffee. Mercer was already sitting at the plaintiff's table. He was leaning back in his leather chair, looking perfectly relaxed. He was adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. Blythe was sitting in the gallery row right behind Langston. Just an hour ago, she'd been up on that witness stand. She had crossed her legs in her tailored navy skirt. She'd adjusted her pearl earrings with a trembling hand. She had looked so beautifully, convincingly tragic. Bless her rotten heart. But the performance was officially over. Miss Vance didn't even sit down at our defense table. She walked straight up to the judge's bench. Her black blazer snapped sharply with every confident step. She placed a thick stack of paper on the mahogany ledge. "Motion to strike witness testimony, Your Honor." Langston's head snapped up from his yellow legal pad. The judge slowly put on his tortoiseshell reading glasses. He picked up the top document of the stack. It was the side-by-side financial timeline Ms. Vance had just drafted. It showed Mercer's exact wire transfers to Palmetto Holdings, LLC. Right next to it, it showed Blythe's monthly $4,000 deposits. The dates lined up with sickening precision. Langston jumped up so fast his chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He objected furiously to the newly introduced documents. He waved his silver pen in the air like a weapon. He called the financial records a desperate, baseless fishing expedition. Ms. Vance just smiled at him. It was a terrifying, shark-like smile. She reached into her structured leather briefcase. She pulled out the glossy color printouts of the photographs from my phone, the independent consulting agreement from Blythe's hidden black leather binder. She handed the pages directly to the judge. "This witness is not a concerned friend, Your Honor." Ms. Vance's voice rang crystal clear through the quiet room. "She is a paid operative of the plaintiff." Langston's face turned the color of a bruised plum. He started shouting loudly about illegal search and seizure. He demanded to know exactly where those photographs came from. Would the judge actually accept photos of a contract taken in secret? You know that feeling when your entire future hangs on one stranger's decision? My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. I gripped the edge of the heavy defense table. The polished wood felt cold and damp under my sweating palms. Ms. Vance calmly cited the fraud exception in Georgia family law discovery. She argued the plaintiff was actively concealing marital assets to fund a conspiracy. The judge held up his hand to stop the arguing. The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could hear a police siren wailing somewhere out on Broughton Street. The judge stared at the printed photograph of the signature page. He looked right at Mercer's distinctive looping signature in blue ink. Then he looked over his glasses directly at Blythe. I turned in my chair to watch her reaction. The color completely drained from her normally flushed face. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the wooden gallery bench. Her knuckles were bone white against the dark oak. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker. And today, his favorite demon was wearing pearls. The judge announced he was accepting the photographs provisionally. The fraud implications were simply too severe to ignore. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. Blythe's entire morning testimony was officially struck from the record. Exhibit J was suddenly a poisoned well of evidence. Mercer's grand conservatorship play was bleeding out on the courtroom floor. I felt a hot rush of triumphant satisfaction wash over me. The crushing, suffocating weight on my chest finally lifted. I took a deep breath of the sterile, conditioned courthouse air. The judge ordered an immediate adjournment for the day. He demanded Langston produce the original physical contract by tomorrow morning. We packed our legal documents back into our briefcases. I walked out of the heavy oak doors into the hallway. The marble floor clicked sharply under my heels. I felt like I had finally won the war. I had survived the hurricane and kept my mother's land. But then I saw Mercer standing near the elevators. He was leaning casually against the marble wall. He wasn't angry. He didn't look panicked or exposed or defeated. His hands were casually tucked into his navy trousers. As he passed me in the hall, he leaned in terrifyingly close. I could smell the sharp peppermint gum on his breath. He whispered, "Check your email, Katie." Topic Chapter 12. I sat in my car outside the Chatham County Courthouse. The Thursday afternoon sun was baking the black leather seats. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my keys. Mercer's whisper was still crawling down my spine. "Check your email, Katie." I pulled my phone from my structured leather briefcase. The screen was smeared with my own nervous fingerprints. I tapped the mail icon. There was one new message at the very top. It was from Langston's law firm. The timestamp said 3002 p.m. The subject line just said Exhibit M. My throat went completely dry. I clicked the PDF attachment. A bright white document filled my screen. It had a formal medical letterhead at the top. Coastal Psychiatric Associates, Dr. Arthur Fenwick. I stared at that name. The letters started to blur together. Blythe had handed me his cream-colored business card 10 months ago. We were standing in my kitchen. I was crying over a burnt chicken casserole. She rubbed my back and told me he was incredibly discreet. Bless her rotten heart. My mind snapped back to that single therapy session. It was a Tuesday morning last December. It was pouring rain outside. I sat on a stiff green velvet sofa in his office. The room smelled like lavender and stale coffee. I was absolutely raw for my mother's funeral. I told him I felt like I was losing my mind. I told him things kept moving around my historic townhouse. I told him about the misplaced truck keys. I told him about the stove being left on. Dr. Fenwick just sat there. He wore heavy tortoiseshell reading glasses. He didn't offer me a tissue. He just kept scratching notes with a silver pen. He looked at me like I was a specimen in a glass jar. Now I knew why. I blinked the memory away. I was back in the sweltering car. The dashboard clock read 30:14 p.m. I scrolled down the PDF on my phone. It was 12 pages long, 12 pages of fabricated medical history. The bold text jumped out at me. Comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. I read the first paragraph. My stomach dropped into freefall. Patient exhibits textbook symptoms of early onset dementia. I gasped for air. The car felt like a locked oven. I kept reading, complicated by severe paranoid delusions and emotional volatility. I scrolled to the methodology section. It listed his sources, based on clinical observation and extensive interviews. I held my breath. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Interviews with close family and friends. Blythe. It was always Blythe. She didn't just plant the seeds of my insanity. She watered them for a licensed medical professional. She caused the accidents in my home. She documented my reactions in her forged journal. Then she reported them to Dr. Fenwick as a concerned friend. It was a perfectly choreographed dance. Mercer paid her $4,000 a month to create the symptoms. How much did he pay Dr. Fenwick to diagnose them? I swiped to the final page of the document. There it was. The killing blow. The words were typed in crisp, black Arial font. It is my professional medical opinion that Mrs. Mercer is entirely unfit. I felt my heartbeat throbbing in my teeth. She is incapable of managing her own estate. This is a formal petition for conservatorship. Mercer didn't need Exhibit J to win. He had a board-certified doctor's signature. He had a medical stamp of approval to steal my life. He needed me declared legally incompetent. That was the only way to seize the Jamaican coastal land. The 40 acres my mother left me. The land Palmetto Holdings LLC wanted to pave over for a luxury resort. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. It landed with a heavy thud. I gripped the leather steering wheel. My knuckles turned completely white. That is why Mercer was smiling in the courtroom. He didn't care that the judge struck Blythe's testimony. He didn't care that the forged journal was exposed. He had been building this medical file for 10 months. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. I stared blindly at the courthouse steps through my windshield. How do you discredit a board-certified psychiatrist? A man with a wall full of framed Ivy League diplomas? He had to be on the payroll, just like Blythe. Palmetto Holdings didn't just buy my best friend of 28 years. They must have bought my doctor, too. I snatched the phone back up. The metal casing was hot from the sun. I needed to see Dr. Fenwick's bank records. I needed to find a wire transfer. The air conditioning in my car finally kicked on. It blasted cold air against my damp forehead. I was sweating straight through my emerald linen blazer. I felt a scream building in my chest. A deep, ugly, feral sound. I swallowed it down like broken glass. I couldn't afford to break down. Not here. Not now. If this document entered the official court record tomorrow morning, it was over. A judge would strip away my financial autonomy. Mercer would be handed the keys to my entire world. I looked at the heavy brass courthouse doors. Langston and Mercer were probably still inside. Probably shaking hands. Probably laughing at me. Blythe's testimony wasn't the weapon. It was just the distraction. The real trap had already snapped shut around my neck. I stared at the 12-page PDF glowing on Ms. Vance's laptop screen. Exhibit M. Dr. Arthur Fenwick's official psychiatric evaluation of Keturah Mercer. My hands were ice cold against the leather arms of the guest chair. Blythe's fake tears in the courtroom were just a magic trick, a theatrical distraction meant to keep us looking the wrong way. Mercer didn't need a forged journal to take my estate. He had a board-certified doctor declaring me legally incompetent. I read the clinical text on the screen. Patient exhibits severe cognitive decline and paranoid delusions. Recommendation, immediate full conservatorship. I looked across the mahogany desk at Miss Vance and Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes had loosened his silver silk tie. He looked physically sick. He had never seen a conspiracy this deep. I pointed a trembling finger at the laptop screen. "We have to prove Fenwick is on Mercer's payroll," I said. Ms. Vance didn't hesitate for a single second. She picked up her desk phone and dialed the local Savannah number. "I'm calling Marcus," she said. "He's the most ruthless private investigator in Chatham County." While we waited, my mind drifted back 2 years. It was the annual spring gala at the Savannah Golf Club. The air smelled like roasted pecans, blooming jasmine, and expensive bourbon. I was wearing my emerald linen blazer. I remembered walking out onto the wraparound stone veranda. Mercer was standing by the ivy-covered railing. He wasn't alone. Dr. Fenwick was right beside him. They were both smoking thick Cuban cigars, laughing entirely too loudly into the humid night air. I remembered hearing the clink of their crystal highballs. I thought it was an odd pairing back then. A cutthroat real estate developer and a high society psychiatrist. Now, sitting in this freezing law office, it made perfect sense. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker. And apparently, he plays 18 holes with your doctor. By 6:45 p.m., the sky outside the office window was pitch black. Rain was lashing against the glass panes. The heavy oak door of the office finally swung open. Marcus walked in wearing a damp beige trench coat. He smelled like stale black coffee and cheap peppermint gum. He didn't even say hello. He just tossed a thin manila envelope onto the glass coffee table. "You were right," Marcus said, his voice like grinding gravel. "The good doctor has a very expensive bad habit." I leaned forward and pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope. It was a printed bank statement. My eyes scanned the black ink under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't a local Truist account this time. This was an offshore wire transfer receipt. The destination was a Cayman Islands casino account. The receiving entity was listed as AF Consulting Group. Arthur Fenwick. The initials were a dead giveaway. The sender was Palmetto Holdings, LLC, the exact same shell company Mercer used to pay Blythe. I looked at the specific dollar amount, $85,000, paid in a single lump sum. The date on the transfer was October 19th. Just 1 week before Palmetto Holdings filed that Jamaican zoning inquiry, a hot wave of grim satisfaction washed over my chest. My pulse hammered violently in my throat. Dr. Fenwick wasn't just a corrupt medical professional. He was a degenerate gambler drowning in casino debt. I picked up the bank statement and held it to the light. Mercer hadn't just asked for a medical favor. He had bought the man's Ivy League medical license outright. I traced my fingernail over the $85,000 figure. "He paid off his casino markers," I whispered to the room. Ms. Vance adjusted her sharp black blazer. "And in exchange, Fenwick wrote Exhibit M," she said. "A fake dementia diagnosis to hand Mercer your ancestral land." I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath. The scent of my lavender perfume mixed with Marcus's stale coffee. For 10 agonizing months, I thought my mind was breaking. I thought the misplaced truck keys were my fault. I gripped the edge of the glass coffee table. I thought the burnt chicken casseroles were my failing memory. But it was all just a coordinated, expensive theatrical production. I stared at the black ink on the receipt. A 28-year friendship bought for $4,000 a month. A medical diagnosis bought for $85,000. They had priced out my sanity like a piece of antique furniture. Bless their rotten hearts. They really thought I was just a naive Southern belle. I looked back at the glowing laptop screen. Exhibit M was supposed to be my absolute death warrant. Instead, it was the rope they were going to hang themselves with. Mr. Hayes finally spoke up from the corner of the room. "We take this to the judge tomorrow morning," he said. "We get Fenwick's testimony thrown out completely." I slowly shook my head. My reflection stared back at me in the dark window pane. I didn't look like a scared Savannah housewife anymore. I looked like a woman who had survived a Category 5 hurricane. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady drawl. "We let Langston enter it into the official court record first." Ms. Vance raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "If we let them enter it, it becomes felony perjury," she said. "Exactly," I replied, tapping the offshore bank receipt on the desk. We had the proof to destroy the doctor. But I didn't just want to win the divorce. I wanted to burn Mercer and Blythe's world to the ground. I left Miss Vance's office and drove straight to a CVS on Broughton Street. The sun was just starting to set. The sky was the color of a bruised peach. I walked down the harsh fluorescent aisle. I bought a prepaid track phone for $29. I paid with crisp $29 bills. Cash leaves no trail. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting at the mahogany dining table in my historic townhouse. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and the gardenias blooming in the courtyard. I placed the cheap black plastic phone on the table. It felt light in my hands. Too light for a weapon. But that's exactly what it was. I needed bait. Something that would make Blythe panic enough to make a mistake. My mind drifted back to a Tuesday afternoon 7 months ago. I had just come home from an estate appraisal in Charleston. I unlocked my heavy oak front door. I walked into my foyer. The floor was covered in shattered blue and white porcelain. My great-grandmother's Ming Dynasty vases were completely destroyed. I remember the sick crunch of ceramic under my heel. Blythe was standing there with a yellow plastic broom. She had perfectly manufactured tears in her eyes. She told me the neighbor's orange tabby had sneaked in. She swore the cat knocked them off the console table. I sat on the bottom step of the antique mahogany banister and cried for 2 hours. Blythe sat next to me. She held my hand and stroked my hair. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. Or in her case, a beige cashmere cardigan. Now I knew the absolute truth. She broke those priceless heirlooms on purpose. It was just another orchestrated accident to make me feel out of control. I picked up the track phone. I punched in Blythe's number using the clunky rubber buttons. My fingers were completely steady. I typed out a message. I know what you did for Palmetto Holdings. I needed a visual to sell a threat. I opened my laptop and dug into my own security archives from 7 months ago. I found a grainy dark frame from the living room camera. It showed a vague silhouette of a woman standing near the console table. You couldn't see her face, but you could clearly see the outline of that beige cashmere cardigan. I took a digital screenshot. I attached the image to the text message. I added one more line. Bring $50,000 to Couture's townhouse tonight at midnight, or Mercer gets this video. I hit send. A cold rush of power flooded my chest. My hands went completely numb. I could feel my heartbeat echoing in my throat. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the predator. Would you have sent it? Be honest. I didn't even hesitate. I kept my laptop open. I navigated to the Ring website. Blythe had given me her doorbell camera login 3 years ago. She wanted me to check on her golden retriever while she was at a spa in Atlanta. Bless her rotten heart. She never bothered to change the password. The timestamp on my laptop screen read 8:45 p.m. The live feed buffered for a second. Then Blythe appeared on her front porch in Ardsley Park. The night vision camera made her eyes glow a demonic white. She was pacing frantically across the painted wooden floorboards. Her hands were shaking violently. She held her silver iPhone pressed hard against her ear. She wasn't calling the Savannah police. You don't call the cops when you're guilty of felony fraud and extortion. She was calling her boss. She was calling my husband. I watched her mouth move on the silent black and white feed. She looked absolutely terrified. The sight of her panic tasted like expensive bourbon. I closed the laptop. The screen went black. I walked into my living room and turned on the crystal chandelier. The warm light hit the empty space on the console table where my vases used to sit. I walked into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of iced sweet tea. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal highball glass. I sat down on my stiff green velvet sofa. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my navy trousers. I checked the glowing screen of my phone. It was exactly 9:15 p.m. I had less than 3 hours to prepare the battlefield. The trap was officially set. The bloody bait was in the water. I just had to wait for the rats to swim toward it. I knew Blythe was too much of a coward to face a blackmailer alone. She was terrified of her own shadow. And I knew Mercer wouldn't let her handle a shakedown without him. He was too much of a control freak. He needed to protect his $85,000 investment in my destruction. They would both come to my house tonight. Topic, Chapter 15. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. Every single strike vibrated through the antique floorboards. I sat perfectly still on the green velvet sofa. The parlor was pitch black. Outside, tires crunched over the cobblestone driveway. They were here. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't afraid. I was starving. Underneath the glass coffee table, 3 separate digital recorders were already rolling. I had taped them right next to the antique brass legs. I raised my left wrist in the dark. The tiny screen of my Apple Watch glowed blue. I tapped the red circle to record. The audio visualizer spiked as the front gate creaked open. Footsteps echoed on the front porch. 2 sets of shoes. Heavy leather loafers and sharp designer heels. Then came the sound I was waiting for. Metal scraping against metal. Mercer's old silver key sliding into the brass deadbolt. He actually kept it. The heavy oak door swung open with a familiar groan. A sliver of yellow street lamp light sliced across the Persian rug. They stepped into the foyer. Blythe was whispering frantically. "Where is he?" she hissed. "Just keep quiet and let me handle the money," Mercer muttered. He was carrying a thick leather briefcase. They thought they were meeting a blackmailer. They thought some anonymous stranger had the photos of their little contract. They walked past the mahogany banister and stepped into the parlor. The air smelled like my lavender candle and Blythe's expensive Chanel perfume. I let them stand in the dark for 3 full seconds. Then I reached over and flicked the switch on the brass reading lamp. Yellow light flooded the room. Blythe actually shrieked. She dropped her Prada handbag right onto the hardwood floor. Mercer froze. His knuckles turned stark white around the handle of that briefcase. He was wearing his signature navy seersucker suit. The devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker. "Hello, Mercer?" I said. My voice was a low, gravelly scrape. "Evening, Blythe." Blythe's face lost every drop of color. She looked like a ghost wrapped in a beige cashmere cardigan. "Katie," Mercer breathed. His eyes darted around the shadows of the parlor. "Where is the guy?" he demanded. I smiled. It felt like stretching a scar. "There is no guy, darling," I said. "It's just me." I watched his brain try to process the trap. I bought this historic townhouse in 1999. I paid for it with my own money. I remember sitting at the mahogany desk signing the deed. Mercer had stood behind me, glaring at the paperwork. He was furious that his name wasn't on the title. He had coveted these brick walls for 24 years. Now he was standing in my parlor, trying to steal it. Blythe took a trembling step backward toward the foyer. "You sent the photos," she whispered. Her voice was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. "You taped the key under my desk." "Bless your rotten heart, Blythe," I said. I leaned back against the stiff green velvet. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Mercer set the heavy briefcase on the floor. He adjusted his silver-soled tie. His panic was already morphing into cold, calculated anger. "You're playing a dangerous game, Katie," he said. "Am I?" I asked. I picked up a glossy color printout from the sofa cushion. It was a photo of the independent consulting agreement. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed right above the hidden microphones. $4,000 a month, I read aloud. "To monitor my habits, to hide my truck keys, to break my mother's Ming Dynasty vases." I looked dead into Blythe's terrified eyes. 28 years of friendship, bought for a Savannah estate. Blythe started to cry. Real tears this time. They left wet tracks through her expensive foundation. "He made me do it, Katora," she sobbed. "He said you were losing your mind. He said you needed help." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The sound bounced off the crystal chandelier above us. "Help?" I asked. "Like the help you suggested 10 months ago?" I watched Mercer's jaw clench. "I remember that day so clearly," I said. I traced the gold gardenia necklace at my throat. "We were having iced sweet tea in the kitchen. You held my hand. You told me I was forgetting things. You handed me Dr. Fenwick's cream-colored business card." I stood up from the sofa. The floorboards creaked under my bare feet. "You called him a discreet professional," I said. I took one step closer to her. "You forgot to mention he was Mercer's golfing buddy." Blythe stopped crying. She looked at Mercer in pure, unadulterated panic. "You forgot to mention Mercer paid him $85,000, I said. I kept my voice low, steady, and lethal. "You set me up to be diagnosed with dementia. You wanted to lock me away." The parlor was dead silent. Only the grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. I could smell the sharp peppermint gum Mercer was chewing. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look defeated. He just looked annoyed. He took a step forward, planting his expensive loafers on my Persian rug. Mercer sneered at me. "You think a few text messages matter, Katie?" he said. "I own the judge. I own the doctor. You're leaving here in a straitjacket." I own the judge. The words hung in the air of my parlor. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner. He had no idea what he had just done. Mercer stood there in his Navy seersucker suit looking like a king. But the devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker. My heart didn't even skip a beat. I just looked down at my wrist. My Apple Watch face was glowing in the dim light. The red recording circle was pulsing. That was mic number 1. Taped onto the mahogany side table was a digital recorder. Mic number 2. Behind the ceramic rooster on the mantel was mic number 3. And tucked inside the green velvet sofa cushion was mic number 4. 4 pristine audio feeds, all capturing my soon-to-be ex-husband admitting to felony bribery. I looked down at the floor. The thick leather briefcase sat heavily on the Persian rug. He had brought the $50,000. Or so he thought. He brought it to pay off a nameless blackmailer. But he was just delivering evidence to his wife. I nudged the brass latch with my bare toe. It didn't budge. I didn't care about the cash inside. I cared about the woman standing 3 feet behind him. Blythe was trembling. Her hands were clutching her Prada handbag like a life preserver. Her pale green eyes were darting toward the heavy oak front door. She wanted to run. I stepped closer to her. The hardwood floor felt cold under my bare feet. I looked right into her terrified face. Why? I asked. My voice was a low, steady whisper. What was worth 28 years of my life? Blythe opened her mouth. No sound came out. She just stared at my gold gardenia necklace. Mercer let out a sharp, ugly laugh. The sound echoed off the crystal chandelier. "Oh, Katie," he sneered. "Don't play dumb." He reached into his suit jacket pocket. He pulled out his silver iPhone. His thumb swiped across the illuminated screen. He shoved the phone right in my face. The brightness made me squint. I focused on the screen. It was a Zillow listing, a private Make Me Move page. The address at the top was my address. My historic Savannah townhouse. The estimated value was listed at $2.4 million. My stomach dropped to the floor. Mercer tapped the screen again. A PDF document popped up. It was a draft transfer deed. The grantor line had my name on it. The grantee line had hers. Blythe Covington. The $4,000 a month was just a retainer. The townhouse was her real payoff. Suddenly, a memory hit me like a physical blow. It was 10 months ago. We were standing right here in this parlor. I was holding 2 crystal highballs filled with iced sweet tea. Blythe was looking up at that exact same crystal chandelier. Her pale green eyes were wide with envy. She had whispered, "I'd kill to live here." I thought she was just being dramatic. I even laughed. Bless her rotten heart. She wasn't joking. She was making a down payment on my destruction. I could smell the lavender perfume rolling off her skin. It made me want to vomit. I looked back at Blythe. She finally met my gaze. Her face was completely flushed. Then she looked away. She stared down at her beige leather shoes. Absolute disgust washed over me. The betrayal felt like cold mud in my veins. You know that feeling when the ground completely gives way beneath you? That was my reality in that exact second. 28 years of secrets, birthdays, and funerals, all traded for brick and mortar. I took a slow breath. The scent of old wood and gardenias filled my lungs. This was my mother's house. Her mother's house before that. The mahogany banister in the hall held our fingerprints. The floral wallpaper in the dining room held our history. Mercer knew how much this estate meant to me. He knew it was my soul. And he weaponized it. He used it to buy my best friend. He stood there, grinning at me. His silver silk tie caught the light from the brass reading lamp. "She earned it," Mercer said. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "She played her part perfectly." I looked at the heavy leather briefcase on the rug again. Mercer thought he had all the power. He thought he was walking out of here with his secret safe. He thought tomorrow morning Dr. Fenwick would declare me insane. He thought I would be locked in a psychiatric ward. He thought he would pave over my Jamaican coastal land for his resort, and Blythe would get my Savannah estate. I let the silence stretch for a full 3 seconds. I wanted to memorize the smug look on his face. I wanted to remember Blythe's trembling hands. The trap was fully set. The jaws were ready to snap shut. Tomorrow morning in courtroom 4B, the world was going to burn. But tonight, the heartbreak was mine to carry alone. I looked at the woman who used to be my sister. She couldn't even look at me. She didn't just want my husband's money. She wanted my life. My home. my history. And she was willing to send me to an asylum to get it. I looked down at the thick leather briefcase sitting on my Persian rug. $50,000 in crisp $20 bills. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the hallway. It was exactly 12:14 on Thursday night. The air in the parlor felt thick and suffocating. I could smell Blythe's Chanel No. 5 mixed with Mercer's sharp peppermint gum. Mercer was still smiling that smug, terrifying smile. He really thought he had won. Blythe was trembling beside him. Her knuckles were completely white as she clutched her Prada handbag. I stared at her manicured fingers. My mind drifted back 10 months ago. She was standing right there in my foyer. She was running her hands over my antique mahogany banister. I remember the exact look of hunger in her eyes. She had whispered, I would do absolutely anything to live in a house like this. It wasn't a harmless compliment. It was a literal down payment on my destruction. Mercer had promised to deed her my historic Savannah townhouse. All she had to do was gaslight me into a psychiatric ward. Bless her rotten heart. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply nodded. I stood up from the stiff green velvet sofa. The hardwood floor was freezing cold against my bare feet. I walked slowly past the heavy leather briefcase. I moved toward the heavy mahogany pocket doors. They separate my parlor from the formal dining room. I gripped the cool brass handles. I pulled the heavy doors wide open. The dining room was fully lit. Sitting right at my mahogany dining table was Detective Rivas. He is the lead investigator for the Savannah Police Department Fraud Division. Ms. Vance was sitting right next to him in her sharp black blazer. They both had black headphones over their ears. They had heard every single word. Right there on the table, under the crystal chandelier, was a piece of paper. It was an arrest warrant for wire fraud and conspiracy. Mercer's full legal name was printed at the very top in bold black ink. My mind flashed back to earlier that Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the freezing police precinct on Maple Avenue. The room smelled like bleach and stale black coffee. I slid the printed offshore bank statement across a scratched metal desk. I showed Detective Rivas the $85,000 wire transfer. I traced the line showing the money going straight to Dr. Fenwick's Cayman Islands casino account. I had handed him the paper trail of the bribery. Tonight, Mercer had just handed him the verbal confession. I turned back to look at my soon-to-be ex-husband. Mercer's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. The color drained completely out of his face. He looked exactly like a ghost in a seersucker suit. I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated triumph wash over me. My chest felt light for the first time in 11 months. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker, and I had finally caught him. Detective Rivas took off his headphones. He stood up slowly from the mahogany chair. The brass reading lamp reflected off his gold badge. He looked at Mercer and spoke in a low, even tone. We have 4 pristine audio feeds of that entire conversation, Mr. Covington. Ms. Vance walked out of the dining room and into the parlor. She stopped right in front of Mercer. She pointed a manicured finger directly at his chest. Tomorrow morning is Friday, she said, her voice dripping with ice. We are all due back in courtroom 4B for the final legal showdown. Mercer just stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Your bulldog attorney Langston is going to proudly submit Exhibit M to the judge, she continued. He is going to present Dr. Fenwick's forged psychiatric evaluation as absolute fact. I watched Mercer's hands start to shake. He is going to commit felony perjury on your behalf, Ms. Vance whispered. But you won't be there to warn him, because you are going to be sitting in a concrete holding cell. Mercer stumbled backward. His expensive leather shoe hit the heavy leather briefcase. The $50,000 of blackmail money shifted inside. He finally realized the trap wasn't just for him. It was for Langston. It was for Dr. Fenwick. It was for all of them. He looked frantically at the heavy oak front door. He looked at the digital recorder sticking out of my blazer pockets. Mercer tried to run for the front door, but Blythe just sat on my velvet sofa and started to cry. But this time, I didn't hand her a tissue. Mercer didn't even make it to the brass handle of my heavy oak front door. He lunged for it. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the antique Persian rug. Detective Rivas stepped out from the dining room shadows. He grabbed Mercer by the collar of his navy seersucker suit. The thick leather briefcase hit the hardwood floor. It popped open. Banded stacks of crisp $20 bills spilled everywhere. $50,000 of extortion money right on my floor. Mercer was screaming obscenities. The metal handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. I just stood barefoot in the parlor. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. I looked down at the green velvet sofa. Blythe was curled into a ball, sobbing hysterically. Her mascara was running down her face. She reached a shaking hand toward me. I didn't hand her a tissue. I just turned my back and walked upstairs. The next morning, it was exactly 9 o'clock. I was sitting at the plaintiff's table in courtroom 4B. The air smelled like floor wax and stale coffee. Langston was standing at the defense table. He kept checking his gold Rolex. He had no idea his client was currently sitting in a holding cell. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel. Langston cleared his throat. He formally submitted Exhibit M into the official court record. The 12-page psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Fenwick. The perjury trap was officially set. Mr. Hayes stood up and smoothed his silver tie. He handed the judge a single, thin manila envelope. Inside was the printed offshore bank statement, the $85,000 wire transfer from Palmetto Holdings to Dr. Fenwick. The judge put on his tortoiseshell reading glasses. He looked at the paper. The color completely drained from his face. He looked right at Langston. The judge said, "Counselor, where exactly is your client?" Mr. Hayes smiled and said, "Currently in police custody, Your Honor." I watched Langston's knees actually buckle. He grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table to stay upright. The house of cards didn't just fall, it incinerated. A few days later, I was sitting at my kitchen island. The morning sun was warming the marble countertops. I was holding my iPad. I stared at the Savannah Morning News headline. It read, "Prominent developer indicted in bizarre gaslighting plot against wife." Dr. Fenwick lost his medical license by Tuesday. The FBI raided his coastal clinic. They found a dozen other fraudulent evaluations tied to offshore casino debts. He is currently facing 10 years in federal prison. Bless his rotten heart. Exactly 1 month ago, I sat in my home office. I was staring at my laptop screen. It was our final divorce hearing over Zoom. Mercer wasn't wearing his tailored navy suits anymore. He was wearing a bright Orange County jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled to his waist. He looked 10 years older. The judge stamped the final decree with a loud thud. I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. I kept 100% of my assets. I kept the $2.4 million historic Savannah townhouse. Most importantly, I kept the 40 acres of Jamaican coastal land. Now I am back in my kitchen. My mother's gold gardenia necklace is resting against my collarbone. I am holding the physical property deed in my hands. The thick parchment paper feels rough against my fingertips. My name is the only one on it. Katura Mercer. No Palmetto Holdings. No 300-room luxury resort. Just the quiet, untouched earth of my ancestors. I can almost smell the sweet gardenias in the air. My mother's legacy is finally safe. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker, and this devil was finally caged. But this story isn't quite over. Mercer was going to prison, but Blythe had cut a plea deal to avoid jail time. She traded her testimony against Mercer for full immunity. She was going to walk away completely free, which meant I still had one loose end to tie up. Blythe walked out of that police precinct without a single handcuff. She traded Mercer's freedom for her own, full legal immunity. Bless her rotten heart, she thought she had won, but the law isn't the only justice in Savannah. I was sitting at my mahogany dining table the next morning. The physical property deed was resting right in front of me. Thick parchment paper. My name printed in heavy black ink. She wanted this house. She sold 28 years of friendship for it. I ran my fingers over the raised gold seal. The paper felt rough against my skin. The law couldn't touch her, but I certainly could. In this town, your reputation is your currency. Without it, you are entirely bankrupt. I walked into my home office and opened my laptop. The screen glowed bright against the dark floral wallpaper. I drafted a new email. The subject line was simple. It read, "A warning regarding Blythe." I attached the glossy color photos of our independent consulting agreement, all 4 pages, the compensation clause, Mercer's signature, every detail of her $4,000 monthly retainer to gaslight me. I didn't just send it to a few people. I loaded 400 email addresses into the blind copy line. Every country club president, every historic society board member, every mutual friend we had shared since 1995, even the ladies from our Wednesday garden club. My finger hovered over the trackpad. The metal felt cold under my skin. My heart wasn't even racing. I clicked send. Gone. Just like that. Savannah high society moves faster than a marsh fire. By noon, my phone was vibrating off the mahogany side table. I didn't answer a single call. I just poured some iced sweet tea. The condensation dripped down the crystal highball glass. I let the silence fill my beautiful, empty house. It took exactly 3 days for the invitations to stop. Blythe was quietly removed from the Telfair Museum Gala Committee. Her standing reservation at the Savannah Golf Club was mysteriously canceled. I saw it firsthand last Tuesday at the Fresh Market on Broughton Street. I was standing near the peaches. The air smelled like ripe fruit and heavy humidity. Blythe walked down the aisle in her beige cashmere cardigan. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes couldn't be hidden by makeup. She saw Eleanor Vance by the Organic Greens. Blythe smiled and reached out her hand to say hello. Eleanor just stared at her. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. Eleanor simply turned her back and walked her cart right down the aisle. I watched from behind a display of Georgia pecans. Blythe's hand dropped back to her side. Her face flushed completely red. She looked physically sick. She left her empty shopping basket on the floor. She practically ran out the glass doors. I picked up a peach. It felt heavy and perfect in my palm. The devil doesn't wear horns, he wears seersucker, and his little helpers wear cashmere. Blythe thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess. She forgot that I own the board. She's a ghost in her own town now. No one will return her texts. No one will host her for dinner. She sits alone in that Ardsley Park house with her lavender candles. The silence in those rooms must be absolutely deafening. I walked back to my historic townhouse that afternoon. My heels clicked against the cobblestone driveway. I unlocked my heavy oak front door. The smell of gardenias drifted in from the courtyard. This house is mine. It will always be mine. I walked into the parlor and sat on the green velvet sofa. I poured myself another glass of sweet tea. I opened a Zillow app on my iPad. There it was, a brand new listing in Ardsley Park. She wanted my house. Now she's trying to sell hers because no one in Chatham County will even look her in the eye. I set the iPad face down on the green velvet sofa. Blythe's Zillow listing disappeared into the black glass. The parlor was completely silent, just the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stood up and walked over to the mahogany side table. My fingers brushed against a small, faded square of paper. It was the 1998 Polaroid of me and Blythe. We were standing on the cobblestones down by the river. Her arm was thrown tightly around my shoulder. We were laughing so hard my eyes were shut. We were just 28 years old. 28 years of history captured in glossy chemical ink. I carried that little photograph over to the fireplace. The hearth was cold. I had swept it clean of winter ash yesterday. I held the picture by its thick white border. Losing Mercer was just the cutting of a dead branch. Losing Blythe was like ripping out a massive oak tree by the roots. The betrayal of a best friend hollows out your chest. It leaves a drafty, echoing space right behind your ribs. I dropped the Polaroid onto the heavy iron grate. I struck a long wooden match against the brick fireplace surround. The flame flared bright yellow in the dim room. It smelled like sharp sulfur and burning pine. I tossed the match onto the photograph. The glossy surface bubbled instantly. It curled inward and turned black within seconds. I watched Blythe's smiling face melt into thick gray smoke. Gone. Just like that. I turned my back on the ashes and walked into the foyer. I grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak front door. I pulled it open and stepped out onto my wide porch. The humid Savannah air wrapped around me like a warm blanket. It was late afternoon. The shadows from the live oaks were stretching across the lawn. I took a deep, slow breath. The sweet smell of gardenias drifted up from the front beds. My mother planted those bushes 40 years ago. They were blooming beautifully this year, thick white petals glowing in the fading sunlight. I leaned my elbows against the white wooden railing. I looked down the quiet cobblestone street. No silver BMWs parked by the curb. No fake smiles walking up my front steps with iced tea. Just absolute unbroken peace. It cost me a piece of my soul to get here. But the devil doesn't wear horns. He wears seersucker, and I finally sent him packing in an orange jumpsuit. I walked back inside and shut the heavy door. The brass lock clicked into place with a solid thud. I moved into the living room and looked at the glass coffee table. A single piece of crisp white paper sat right in the center. It was a printed first-class Delta ticket to Montego Bay, a one-way flight leaving next Tuesday morning. I picked it up. I traced my thumb over my printed name in black ink. Couture Mercier, soon to be just Couture again. Mercier wanted to pave over my mother's Jamaican coastal land. He wanted a 300-room luxury resort with a casino. He almost stole my sanity to get it. But those 40 acres belong to my bloodline. I am flying down there next week to break ground. We are building a community center, not a hotel, a place for the local children to learn and grow. My mother would have loved that. I set the plane ticket back down on the glass. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of iced sweet tea. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal highball glass. Condensation immediately beaded on the cold sides. I took a long, slow sip. The cold sugar water coated my dry throat. I walked back and sat down on my green velvet sofa. I started recording this whole nightmare just to keep my facts straight. I needed a record of the truth just in case I lost. But sitting here now in the quiet of my own home, I feel different. I feel like someone else out there needs to hear this. Someone else is questioning their own memory right now. Someone else is finding hidden phones and unexplained bank receipts. If my story resonated with you, drop a comment. I want to hear your experiences. I read every single one of them. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it there in your part of the world? Let me know down below. If this story hits you in the gut, drop a like. It helps other people find these videos when they need them most. And if you want to hear more stories from this old appraiser, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you turn on notifications. Hit that bell so you never miss a word. There are a lot of historic homes in Savannah, and every single one of them has a dark secret buried in the floorboards. I survived mine. I still have my antique mahogany banister. I still have my mother's gold gardenia necklace. And most importantly, I still have my mind. They say keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But in my experience, you better make damn sure you know which is which.